Well, this is a story that was told by Max Zeller. He published it in the journal Psychological Perspectives in 1975. Psychological Perspectives is the journal of the Los Angeles Society of Jungian Analysts, and it was in one of the early volumes. And Max Zeller, if I may just say a word about him, he and James Kirsch and Erich Neumann were all Berliners. They were Jews who lived in Berlin, and they all fled Germany in the 1930s. James Kirsch left immediately after Hitler was elected chancellor. He came to Zurich, through Zurich, and he went on to Palestine. And then he left and went to London and eventually ended up in New York in around 1940. Max Zeller was a friend of his wife's, a very close friend of his wife's, Hilde Kirsch. Also, he was trained in jurisprudence in Berlin, but didn't care for that profession. And so gradually he had some analysis with a man named Fenichel, a very well-known psychoanalyst. And then he shifted over to a Jungian in Berlin, finally worked with Heyer in Munich. And Heyer was a close colleague of Jung's. He got a bad reputation because he was a member of the Berlin Psychological Academy that was run by Goering. But he was not an ardent Nazi, and he helped Zeller leave Germany. He gave him a letter of authentication that he could work as a therapist. Zeller and his wife, then her name was Laura, she was 10 years younger than he, they left and went first to England, lived in London for a while, and then because they were good friends with the Kirsches, they also went to Los Angeles. And James Kirsch and Max Zeller founded the Los Angeles Institute in the 1940s. So he was a very important figure in Los Angeles, Zeller was. And at one point, I think it was in the 1950s, he came back to Europe to visit Zurich, and he had a session with Jung, and he brought Jung a dream. And he wanted Jung's comments on his dream. It's a kind of prophetic dream. I quote it. He wrote about it in Psychological Perspectives, in that 1975 article. And I quote it in my book, Jung's Treatment of Christianity, on page 188. Let me just read what Zeller says, because it's very interesting, and what Jung says in response to it. Zeller's dream was this: a temple of vast dimensions was in the process of being built. As far as I could see, he wrote, ahead, behind, right, and left, there were incredible numbers of people building on gigantic pillars. I, too, was building on a pillar. The whole building process was in its very beginnings, but the foundation was already there. The rest of the building was starting to go up, and I and many others were working on it. Then Jung responds to that dream, and it's interesting how Jung interpreted it. How would you interpret it if somebody brought you that dream? I'm not sure I would go where Jung went, but Jung took it as a kind of religious prophecy. And here's what Jung said: that is the temple we all build on. We don't know the people because, believe me, they build in India and China and in Russia and all over the world. That is the new religion. You know how long it will take until it is built? I said, Zeller says back to him, how should I know? Do you know? Jung says back to him, I know. So I asked him how long it would take. He said, almost 600 years. Where do you know that from? I asked. He said, from dreams, from other people's dreams and from my own. This new religion will come together as far as the eye can see. So Jung took that as a prophetic dream, that a new religion was quietly being assembled by many people all over the world. Mind you, this would have been before Jung's death in 1961. In the 1950s, that was the height of the Cold War. It was a very tense period in Europe, and he had very little access to people in China, India, and Russia, but he had traveled to India. He had known Richard Wilhelm, who spent 20 years in China as a missionary. He had some patients from Russia in the 1920s, so he had contact with those parts of the world. And I guess he felt that now at the end of the age of Pisces, a new era was opening up and beginning. And as in the previous transition into the age of Pisces 2,000 years ago, it took about 600 years for Christianity to solidify and come together and formulate all of its doctrines and structures. So maybe he had that in mind with his 600 years, but he says he bases it on dreams that he's had and that patients have told him. What that new religion will look like, he doesn't say. We don't know. Will it be an extension of the previous religion, somehow coming together, assembling a new multifaceted construct, or will it be something altogether new? We're about 75 years after Max Zeller had that dream, so we still have 525 years to go until we see the final result and know if Jung was correct.
And how does it resonate in you, this this vision of Jung, or this prophetic image that he shares?
Well, I think it was based on Jung's own experience. When he created the Red Book, which we now have for the first time, published in 2009, about 100 years after he created it, we can see that he had the experience of formulating a new religious concept or attitude. He calls it the Liber Novus, which is a kind of echo of the New Testament, the new book. I think that became for him the basis of a lot of his thinking and projecting into the future. And that his method was active imagination. So a lot of people have been doing active imagination in the meantime. He taught it to his students. They carried it all over the world. Max Zeller and James Kirsch were enthusiastic Jungians. They would have taught it to all their students and so forth. And we continue it today in Jungian practices. Active imagination, when it's done correctly, as I would say, does create a kind of sacred space within that is not usually altogether original. I mean, it's made up of materials that one can find in mythologies and religions from all over the world. These are archetypal images that reside in the collective unconscious, and they come forward in active imagination. The selection is individual, and so the individual who is practicing active imagination over a period of time will do something like what Max Zeller is talking about, building a temple on a pillar, an individual pillar, that inevitably will have connections with other people who are doing the same kind of work, because we all share in this same foundational aspect of the psyche, the collective unconscious. So the images and themes aren't so different from individual to individual, even though the selection is unique. So if we give that another few hundred years, and the Jungian movement continues to grow and the network continues to deepen and expand, one could see something emerging out of that, I guess. That would be my response to your question.
And where would you see, and would you see Christianity having sort of a place in this also in Jung's vision, or you mean this is something that outgrown Christianity and Christ in a sense, just as you understand it, or as you're?
I think quite a lot is based on the culture out of which you are coming. If you come from a deeply Christian culture, as we do in Europe and North America, I think inevitably there will be a strong Christian influence in what you create out of your own psychological materials. Certainly has been my experience personally, that it really made me into a Christian in a way I wasn't before. I mean, through an inner experience. Now, if you grew up in a Hindu culture and that's your background, it might make you into a kind of new Hindu. I know I have Jewish friends who have claimed, and James Kirsch said this, he was a very secular Jew before he became a Jungian, but as a result of his psychological work and his active imagination, he became much more deeply connected to his own Jewish tradition. So it isn't so much that it takes you away as maybe as extend it or amplify it or connect it to other parts of the archetypal psyche. That's been my experience.